All right, everybody. I want to just really start with I really feel a tremendous amount of gratitude to Ariella Marshall, to Marlon Block, and to Marianne Merrill, who are running our Zoom today. Super grateful for you three because today is, I mentioned last week, an ICAR staff care day. So my support staff is taking care of themselves as they should, and but we really need this week to continue our study. We're hoping to get through the Shabbat prayers, the ICAR Shabbat prayers, in these three, last week, this week, and next week. And the idea here is that we've done a whole, more than a semester. Like, we've been going since the beginning of, since just after the high holiday, studying prayer. And what we did with all that time was to map out the daily prayer, all the pieces of the daily prayers. And now we're ending by taking a look at the Shabbat prayers. But my premise here is that by looking at the daily prayers, we now have a sense of the basic structure of our prayers. And now we can, when we look at something like Shabbat and holiday prayers, we'll see, these are similar but tweaked. And knowing what we know about prayer, the prayer system now, we can see what the tweaks are and how we have a basic sense of the Jewish prayer cycle, and can even open up a Siddur and identify what's new on Shabbat. Now, I know that's a tall order to know all that now. I'm not expecting that that's exactly how you'll feel, but I hope that the experience, if you have been learning with us this past year, will feel different than just something we've done before, with just a plain and simple boot camp. Here's what comes next. Here's what comes next. Here's what comes next, which I have done in this community before, and it is valuable. And in a sense, that's what we're doing again. But I hope that it really feels different now, looking at it through the lens of our study and our experience so far. Okay, today we have arrived at the main event, Shabbat speaking, the main event, or at least the main event on Saturday morning, and that is the Torah service. Torah. Okay, I have a friend who I remember complained to me. He likes prayer. He likes Jewish prayer, and he shows up to shul on time. And he complained to me one day in shul. He said, this Shabbat it's not made for me. It's not designed for me, because I get here at 9 a.m. when the prayers start. I'm here on time, and I'm here to pray. And we're just like whisking through all of the prayers, everything that we covered last week. He says, we're done with that within an hour. And then all of a sudden at about 10 o'clock, for us, we start at 9:30. So let's say all of a sudden about 10:30, the service just grinds to a screeching halt, and everything slows way down as everybody else starts to arrive for the main event, which is the Torah service. And then we spend 2 hours on the Torah service, which actually, just by pages, if you look through your Siddur, it's not that much. Now, of course, we're reading the Torah, so that's where that comes from, but that's not really where the time is spent. The time is spent in greeting the community, honoring people, making announcements, making prayers for our country. It's like town hall. It's suddenly like it is the time to speak out all the good and welfare of our whole community. And my friend says, so I have to sit around while we do that for 2 hours. And then, of course, then it's 12 o'clock and nobody wants to stay for Musaf after that. So we race through Musaf, as Rabbi Brous often puts it. And now for a lightning fast Musaf, because we at ICAR, we want to also do all the traditional prayers, but we've dragged out the Torah service. In fact, we've deliberately dragged out the Torah service. The Torah service really is the main event. And so, we're going to daven Musaf afterwards, but it'll be very, very fast. So my poor friend says the Shabbat morning service wasn't made for me. And I get what he's saying, although I don't get there. I get there on time now because I work there, but I'm not that kind of guy. I get there late like the rest of us, and he's right about one thing, which is the service is designed for those of us who wander in for the Torah service. Okay, the Torah service is it. Now, we're going to therefore spend our hour today mostly covering the Torah service, and then we'll do like a lightning fast coverage of Musaf, as if to parallel the Shabbat morning experience. Last week, we took ourselves all the way up to the Torah service. So what is Psuke de Zimra in the sacred warm-up, we've called it? What is Psuke de Zimra on the weekday, and what's new on Shabbat? We looked at those things. That actually took us a while. Then we looked at the Amidah, the standing silent prayer. Oh, sorry, I'm skipping the Shema because there was almost nothing to look at in the Shema. Shema was virtually the same, though even there were little insertions. And that's what we're keeping our eyes out for as we move through the Shabbat prayers. We've studied the daily prayers now, so these are similar, and yet there are insertions. There's something new here. That's true for the Shema, but even more so for the Amidah, where there's really a total substitution. This is the last thing that we looked at last time, for the middle 12 blessings of the Amidah, which is usually an 18 or 19 blessing prayer. The first three are the same, the last three are the same, but the middle 12 or 13 are taken out, and instead there's just one blessing in the middle that just says, Mekadeshat Shabbat, blessed is God who sanctifies the Sabbath, right? And that'll work actually exactly the same way on, other holidays like Sukkot. First three is the same, last three are the same. Middle blessing will be about Sukkot. Middle blessing will be about Passover. Middle blessing will be about Shavuot. Just parenthetically, that's not true for Rosh Hashanah, right? Which has a longer, there are certain ones that are different, but for our purposes, we're just looking at Shabbat today. Okay, so that takes us up to the Torah service, and then everything grinds to a screeching halt, and rightly so, because it is a big deal. The Torah service is a big deal. We're opening the Ark, and as we open the Ark, we have a kind of encounter with, we don't think that you can see God. We don't think that any person can be God's representative on earth. The closest thing we have to that is the Torah. And so there's a way in which, and some people are uncomfortable with this, I know. There's a way in which we treat the Torah like, that's as close as we get to divinity. And when we open that Ark, it's like, there's our object of worship. Now, we don't quite worship the Torah, but boy, do we get close, right? We kiss it when it comes around, okay? So it's a big deal. And we're gonna move through it piece by piece today, and hopefully notice all the parts, because the Torah service is a big deal, but because we didn't spend much time thinking about it in our preparation this year when we've been looking at the prayers, in part because it's not a prayer. It's not a prayer. Here we are in one of these final classes of our study of Jewish prayer, and we can't help but look at the Torah service on Shabbat, which is not a prayer. It is something else. It is the public recitation of the weekly Torah reading, okay? Which, after all, I must say, is the great love of my life, the weekly Torah reading. So there's, I'm perfectly excited to take this hour and dig into it. So let's say a blessing, and then we'll do just that. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kiddushanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so we're gonna dive in, and I said these last sessions mostly we're just gonna look at the prayer book that we use at Ikar, and we're just gonna move through piece by piece. I'm doing more of the talking than I usually do, because I really just wanna take us through step by step so we really know everything that's in there. Having said that, if you have questions along the way, feel free to raise your hands. I'll pause at certain points and take questions. But before we go there, before we go into the Siddur, there is one thing that I wanna do as background work today, and that is to take a look at least one of the core texts that we how do I say this? One of the origin stories, maybe the core origin story of the public Torah reading. Because the public Torah reading was instituted at a certain point, at a certain very specific point in Jewish history. It was instituted after the return from the Babylonian exile. Babylonian exile was 70 years long. It began, and I always forget the exact dates, but like the 580s BC. And then, just before 500 BC, we returned from the Babylonian exile. We were allowed to return from the Babylonian exile. And Ezra, the sage, and Nehemiah and their cohort were the leaders of the return. And the return, it wasn't just a return, because after all, we had been kicked out of the land and our whole society, ancient Israel as we know it, had ended. And so the temple had been destroyed, no less. And this moment was a moment to rebuild. And so Ezra and Nehemiah are the rebuilders, and they oversee the reconstruction of the temple, right? Itself, the second temple, and that's a big part of their story. But they also begin to put into practice all kinds of new institutions, what's called takanot, or edicts. There are a series of takanot that are attributed to Ezra the scribe, right? Now, that's already interesting. He's a scribe, so you can tell where his head is at. But Ezra the scribe has all kinds of new practices that he wants. It's almost like new legislation. And the point of this new legislation is to give people a stable kind of structure to reorient them back into Jewish sovereign life. In fact, Maimonides taught us early on in this class that the laying out of the prayer book begins in the days of Ezra. So we're really full circle here. Everything we've been studying is, in a sense, the work that begins in the days of Ezra. So there are all kinds of takanot, all kinds of edicts and institutions. Ezra was very insistent on certain practices that he felt would reboot Jewish life. One of those was the public Torah reading. And actually, I said that we haven't studied it, but we could have, because there is a Torah reading on Monday during the morning prayers and Thursday during the morning prayers. And then there is also one on Shabbat morning, and then there's also one on Shabbat afternoon, okay? The one on Shabbat morning, and I've sort of said this already, but let me say it very clear. The one on Shabbat morning is the reading of the weekly parsha. Parsha meaning portion of the Torah. And we cycle through the entire Torah every year. We'll talk about that more in just a bit. But that means that there are 52, there are actually 54 readings in the Torah. Sometimes we read two at once, but we're going to read that whole reading every week, Shabbat morning. Monday, Thursday, and Shabbat afternoon are just a teaser, just the first seventh, the first Aliyah of the Torah reading, as a kind of a teaser to remind us what parsha we're on. But Shabbat morning, we read the entire reading. Now that's glorious. It's a glorious thing to sit and read the Torah together, but it's also difficult, because we're chanting it in a language that many of us do not understand. And even those of us who do, it's very hard to just hear the cantillation and to be following it as if you were listening to a reading. It's a different kind of reading. Okay, so it's a challenging thing to sit and just hear the entire Torah chanted in Hebrew from the entire parsha, that is, from start to finish. Okay, but that difficulty, I assure you, was experienced by the people in Ezra's time. That difficulty is right there at the front and center of the Torah reading institution from the very start. And this is the text that I want to share with you, because it's really a must-know text if you're going to think about the Torah service. And that is the beginning of the book of Nehemiah, chapter 8. Now, the books of Ezra and Nehemiah are the third to last and second to last, penultimate books of the Torah. And then there's the books of Chronicles. But really, the Ezra and Nehemiah are just one long story. So one's named after Ezra, one's named after Nehemiah. They were both leaders in the returning community. And this is late then in that story, in the 8th chapter of the book of Nehemiah. And they have now rebuilt the temple. They have rebuilt the temple. So it's an incredibly moving passage where they describe the temple, and people are crying when they see the temple. And some of them had seen it 70 years ago, but most of them hadn't. It was a very emotional experience, very, very monumental, literally monumental experience. Okay, and then once the temple is built, the temple has been built, that's been most of the story so far, suddenly the people come to Ezra, what I've said, Ezra instituted all these edicts, these takanot, but in this case, the people themselves come to Ezra, and it is quite a beautiful scene. We'll just read it together to kind of prepare us for where did this all come from? Well, it comes from those days. So here is it's just going to be one sheet where we're going to look at together, but it's a little source sheet that I put together on Sefaria, where we're going to look at the book of Ezra. Now, just listen to this. The entire people assembled as one man, ki'ish echad, right? That's the literal there, ki'ish echad, as one man. Everybody was together as one person in the square before the Watergate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the scroll of the Torah of Moses with which the Eternal had charged Israel. Okay, the people returned from exile. The first thing they thought about was rebuilding the temple. But once the temple was built, they said, bring us the Torah. Bring us the Torah. So on the first day of the 7th month, and in biblical language, that's Rosh Hashanah. On Rosh Hashanah, on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the Torah. He was also a priest, brought the Torah before the congregation. Now listen to this. Listen to this. Men and women, everybody, all the people. Our tradition is sometimes very gendered, but in this case, everybody, and all who could listen with understanding. That's an interesting phrase too, because it means these first people, men and women, were not people who could listen with understanding, okay? So most of the people spoke Aramaic and they would not understand the Torah, but there were some people who could. So Ezra read it facing the square before the Watergate from the first light until midday to the men and the women and those who could understand. Also some men and women who could get it, but most of them couldn't. The ears of all the people were given to the scroll of the Torah. They were turned towards the scroll of the Torah. Ezra the scribe stood upon, now this is beautiful. Ezra the scribe stood upon a wooden tower made for the purpose, right? Migdal Eitz, a wooden tower. Now, this is the origin for the idea of the bima, right? The elevated platform upon which the reader goes to read to the people. That's the source right here in the Bible. And beside him stood all of these people, Matziah, Shema, Anaya, Uriah, Chilkiah, and Messiah to his right, and his left, Pedaiah, Mishael, Milchiah, Chashum, Chashbadana, Zachariah, and Meshulam. And then Ezra opened the scroll in the sight of all the people, for he was above all the people. And as he opened it, all the people stood up. Now that also should sound familiar. He raises the Torah, and as he raises the Torah, everybody stands up. So we're going to look at that today. Ezra blessed the eternal, the great God, and all the people answered, Amen, Amen, with their hands upraised. That we don't still do, the hands upraised, but we do a version of it, actually. We do a version of it. But this is also the source for blessing the Torah. When we read the Torah, we bless the Torah. Then they bowed their heads and prostrated themselves before the Eternal with their faces to the ground. More names, which I'm going to skip right now, while the people stood in their places. And they read from the scroll of the Torah of God, translating it and giving the sense. So now that's important. And one wonders why we don't have that anymore. They would read the Torah and then they would speak out a translation, an Aramaic translation, so that people understood the reading. Bring that back, folks. We could use that. But okay, this is just one last line here. This is, so you now have seen the source for the public Torah reading, but just one last line here, just because it's so heartbreakingly beautiful. Nehemiah, the Tirshata, Ezra, the priest and scribe, meaning he was from Tirshat, that's what that means. And Nehemiah, the Tirshata, Ezra, the priest and scribe, and the Levites who were explaining to the people, said to all the people, "This day is holy to the Eternal your God. You must not mourn or weep." For all the people were weeping as they listened to the words of the Torah. Unbelievable, unbelievable. Just imagine that sight. They had been exiled for 70 years. They return, they try to rebuild, and then they call for the Torah, and Ezra goes up on a tower, opens the Torah, then reads the Torah to the people, and they're crying. They're crying. This is what they've been longing for. This is what they've been dreaming about in the 70 years in Babylon. Okay, so that's an introduction to the Torah service. Now we're going to take a look at it inside in the Siddur itself. Before I move any further, let me ask: are there any questions or anything you are confused about or want to make sure I cover before the hour is up? Yes, sorry, Ellen.
Can you explain what the pinky
Yes.
thing? Thank you.
Yes, we will do that. We will do that as well. The pinky thing that you're alluding to is, I think, inspired by this idea that they all put their hands up, but actually was not part of the original. It's a later institution, the whole pinky thing. We'll talk about that in a sec. Okay, any other questions? Matt Silberstein.
Just a real quick, is this something that rabbis generally know? That if I went to most rabbis, would they say, "Oh yeah, we got this from this"? And is this sort of a class at rabbinical school kind of thing?
I don't know about it. Yeah. I don't know exactly how to answer that question, but I would say, yeah, any rabbi worth their salt should know that this idea of public Torah reading began with Ezra. I must say, having said that, I only recently looked back at Nehemiah and saw how vivid it is. I hadn't made that connection. So yeah,
I was actually thinking about this whole class that you've been doing. That is this knowledge of the structure.
Yeah.
Because I feel like I've just had a bomb go off in my head. It's so expanding. Is this?
Yeah, it's interesting that you say that. I mean, this is the whole conversation, which we don't have time for now, but it is interesting that you say that, because in yeshiva, traditionally, we don't study the liturgy. We study the Talmud, and then maybe we study the laws, but like the composition of the Siddur is not a yeshiva topic. But you're right that when you go to rabbinical school, right, which is a certain form of yeshiva study where you're preparing to be a community leader, they do start introducing the structure of the Siddur itself. Because, and I have felt, for all of that, I have to say, I've learned what I have been teaching. I think I've learned more of since I started my job at Ikar than I had before. So yeah, somewhere in my head, I had a vague sense of this, but you begin to realize when you're a congregational rabbi that the Siddur is one of the things you really have to know and be able to explain. And the answer in a way is no, you didn't really study that in yeshiva, you just did it. You didn't study the parts. So yeah, that's the beginning of an answer. It's an interesting question. The place of liturgy study in yeshiva, right? Leah Matsui.
Is it true, or am I mistaken, that the Torah scrolls at Ikar are survivors of the Holocaust from Czechoslovakia?
Oh, I don't know that. I don't know. Does anyone else know that? Brianna, that's correct. Brianna, do you want to?
One of them is. I don't know about all of them, but one of them is.
Yeah, I mean, look, there's so much to say here, and the Torah scroll itself is an incredibly rich legal and spiritual discussion in Jewish tradition, the significance of a Torah scroll, the way that it's written, the calligraphy, everything about it is, there's so much to look at here. But we're already halfway through our time, and our job is to go through the text of the Siddur itself. So let's do that. And I want to say that I am going to use the Lev Shalem Siddur that we use at Ikar, the red Siddur. You can download that or any piece of that here, but I'm going to screen share it. And I'm gonna. I only put the screen up, the share screen up when we're really looking at the text. But I'm going to have it up for most of the rest of our session so that we can scroll through the Torah service itself. So let's begin, and check my time here. Yeah, I'm really halfway through. Okay, so we're gonna have to get moving. All right, so let's take a look now. The Torah service begins when what has just happened? We have just finished the Amidah. We just finished the Amidah that ends here. Here's the last blessing in the Amidah, Sim Shalom, peace, a blessing for peace. And then we have a Kaddish Shalem, a full Kaddish. After every section of our prayers, we punctuate it with a Kaddish, and then we move into the Torah service. That's on page 168 in the Lev Shalem. And we're not going to spend much time looking at every single verse, but I will tell you that these verses here are unique to Shabbat and holidays. These flourishes here are from the Psalms. But during Monday and Friday Torah readings, we begin here, okay? So there are some introductory, because it's Shabbat and it's more special, there's some introductory lines. Nothing compares to you, as Sinead O'Connor once said, Adonai, and nothing is like your creation. Your sovereignty is eternal. Your dominion endures in every generation, right? God is so great. God is so great. God is so great. It's a big trumpet blast flourish of, we're about to take out the Torah, but we haven't taken out the Torah yet, okay? We haven't taken out the Torah yet. So, Ein kamocha ve'elohim Adonai ve'ein kamasecha, or whatever tune we're going to use. What do we use at Ikar? I can't remember. Ein kamocha ve'elohim Adonai ve'ein. No, I can't remember. Okay, but there's some singing here before we open the ark, okay? And then we all, as the notation says, we all rise here as the ark is open. Vayhi bin Saron, Vayomer Moshe. Now this line we say every time we open the ark. It's this line here. As the ark was carried forward, Moses would say, Adonai, rise up and scatter your foes so that your enemy may flee your presence. Now that may seem like a strange thing to say, talking about our enemies. But it is taken from the book of Numbers, where they were carrying around the ark. They were carrying around the ark, okay, in the desert. So they spoke about moving the ark around, and that's why this is the reference point. When the ark was carried forward. So we use it when the ark was opened. Okay, so Kum Adonai ve'afutzu oivecha ve'anusu misanecha mipanecha. And then a line from Isaiah, Ki mitzion, Torah shall go forth from Zion, and the word of Adonai from Jerusalem. Praised is the one who gave Torah to the people of Israel in holiness. Okay, so the line from the book of Numbers where they actually talked about the ark, the line from Isaiah, where the Torah actually goes out because it's coming out of the ark. And that's how we begin the Torah service. At this point, we're all standing and the ark is open and we're just sort of facing the ark and singing these words. Okay, then there are all kinds of prayers that we say. You can see there are like extra prayers here, a prayer when sad even, but we're not going to talk about those. These are extra insertions. What is there, and we even say it at Ikar, what is there as a kind of meditation before we actually take out the Torah is Brich Shmei Demara Alma, which is blessed is the name of the ruler of the universe, ruler of the universe, Mara de Alma. Okay, ruler of the universe, praise be your name. Now this passage right here is from the Zohar, the great mystical text of Judaism. And you can see over here that the mystic Isaac Luria, the Arizal, recommended that this prayer be recited before the open ark. Okay, Shabbat, I will say, Shabbat is a time when you will see more Kabbalistic insertions into our prayers than usual. We'll see more of that next week when we look at Kabbalat Shabbat. The mystics had a real influence on how we approach our Shabbat prayers. So this is a passage from the Zohar that we recite. Usually we recite it quietly, but it's there. So why is it there? What did the mystics want from this? Well, the truth is, it's not that mystical. It's from the Zohar, but it's actually just, may it be your will to grant us long life. It's just nice things to say. You rule over all, but it does say at the bottom, I am a servant of the Holy One whom I revere and whose precious Torah I revere in every time and place. May it be your will that you open my heart to your Torah. Okay, so it's as we stand there, we recite this meditation that ends Be'anarachitz velishme kadisha kadisha yakira anaimar tushpechon. Lots of different tunes there. Usually we don't sing it in full at Ikar, but it ends there with this meditation ends there, and then we take out the Torah. Okay, so we stand there in front of the Torah. We recite a verse from the book of Numbers, a verse from the book of Isaiah, and then that meditation from the Zohar, and then we take out the Torah. And here is the Shema. We recite. The person who takes out the Torah, actually, usually the person who it's an honor to open the ark, and the person who opens the ark will often take out the Torah and then give it to the person leading the Torah service. In many cases, that would be me, right? The person who opens the ark will give the Torah to me, and then I will turn around. Or if it's a bat mitzvah or a bar mitzvah, we'll hand it to the bat mitzvah, and she will hold the Torah. Usually it's pretty big on her or him, but she will turn around and she will say, and these are the first words you'll hear from the bat mitzvah Ikar, Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. The tune doesn't matter because the tune, that's our congregation's tune, but you can use lots of different tunes. But the person holding the Torah recites Shema and then recites, our God is one, great is our sovereign, holy is God's name. Echad Eloheinu Gadol Adonenu Kadosh Shemo. Okay, those lines are only there on Shabbat and holidays. Okay, if you took out the Torah on a weekday, you would not have all of that flourish and fanfare. And that's part of what I'm trying to show, is that Shabbat prayers just have a little extra, a little more for flourish and fanfare. This line makes a lot of sense because it's a line taken from Psalms, and the person holding the Torah says, Gadlu l'Adonai iti. Join me in glorifying God. Let us together acclaim God's name. I'm holding the Torah. Join me. We're now going to celebrate God. Okay. And then once the leader has said that, then as you can see here, the Torah is carried in a circuit around the congregation. So the Torah goes out, and remember that when your Torah would go out, right? So the Torah goes out traveling among the congregation as if to parallel the movement in the book of Numbers. The Torah is circling the congregation, and while it is, we recite these verses, also from Psalms, also a lot of flourish. Yours is the greatness, the strength, the glory. I'm not going to go through all of the words here. A lot of what's important is just that you know that this is the section where we're carrying the Torah around, and we're all still standing, right? If we're able to stand, we stand as long as the Torah is being carried around. In fact, there is a halacha, a law, that if a Torah passes by you, let's say right now we're sitting and studying and someone walks by me with a Torah, I would stand, because we always stand when a Torah passes by, because that we treat the Torah like royalty, like a king, like a queen that is passing by. Okay, so that's anytime we lift the Torah, everybody stands as if the queen is passing by. Okay, so let's take a look again. We're back now as the Torah is going around the congregation. Okay, and then we're ready to start reading the Torah. Now, maybe I'll unscreen share for a sec because I want to say this clearly. The reading of the Torah, there are a lot of different traditions around the reading of the Torah, lots of different traditions. From the very start, there was a difference between the practice in Babylon and the practice in the land of Israel. In Babylon, I believe, they would read the entire Torah every year, and so they'd read the whole Parsha. In the land of Israel, I think, they would go slower, meaning there's still a community in exile. So they had one practice. In Israel, they would go slower and they would do what's called a triennial reading. But hold on, because we do a triennial reading at Ikar, but it's not the same. What they would do is they would move at 1/3 the pace, and they would cycle through the entire Torah every 3 years. Okay. The practice developed in, I think it is liberal communities in the United States of America. I'm not sure if it has a different origin, but I think it actually developed here to do a kind of hybrid model where we do 1/3 of the reading of the Torah. And the idea being it's just a big burden to read the entire thing when not everybody's understanding what's going on. But we also want to be in sync with the cycle of yearly reading of the Torah. So what we do is we read 1/3 of the Parsha. And the triennial cycle is that in the first year, we read the first third. In the second year, we read the second third. And we are in the third year of the triennial cycle. The liberal American Jewish triennial cycle. So we are at the last third of every Parsha. And if you go to Ikar week after week, you'll hear the last third of every Parsha read. There are different ways of doing it, and there are all sorts of complicated. If the Parsha is very short, we just read the whole thing anyway, all kinds of complicated exceptions. But that's one of the things that could be different from congregation to congregation. The other thing is the amount, we're about to start talking about calling people up to the Torah. Okay, calling people up for an Aliyah, what's called an Aliyah, which is a going up. We talk about making Aliyah to Israel, right? Going up to the land of Israel. And that's in part because you would actually climb up to Jerusalem. It's on a mountain. So similarly, it was literal here too, that you would have to go up to remember the Tower of Wood? You'd have to go up to the elevated platform to read from the Torah. Now, the person who read from the Torah used to be one person who would read the entire reading, and they would make a blessing before and a blessing after. Then eventually the reading was divided up in order to distribute the reading as an honor to more than one people. But the practice was you would go up, say a blessing, and then read your part, and then finish the blessing. But then it quickly enough became clear that there weren't that many people who could do that, right? It's a very specialized skill because reading the Torah in our tradition is memorizing the notations, the scribal this is not even scribal notations. This is like the tradition, the Masoretic tradition of chanting every word in a particular way. Now, there are different traditions there too. It's all very complicated, but the point is that it's difficult. And so very few people would be able to go up to the Torah. So they changed the practice and they instituted the new practice that most of the world follows now, where someone is called up to the Torah, they make the blessings on behalf of the reader, and that's the honor, and then the reader reads it. Okay, so that's why the reader always finishes and says, Amen, Amen. Now you've blessed the Torah for me and I will read it. And then the person called up to the Torah at the end of that reading reads the blessing after. Okay, so that's different. Here's some more differences. There are now 7 aliyot, 7 to parallel Shabbat. During the regular weekday reading, there are 3 aliyot. During a holiday reading, there are 5 aliyot. Okay, but don't worry, don't remember all that. What to remember for today is that on Shabbat, there are 7, and not surprised, we always break things up into 7 on Shabbat, 7 aliyot. Okay, and the last thing that varies from community to community, and actually, I wasn't even aware of this until I came to Ikar. I grew up with the practice that the first, second, and third aliyot had to be read by someone from a priestly family, a Kohen, then someone who was not a priest, but was still from the tribe of Levi, a Levite. And then the third one had to be read by an Israelite, they call it, someone who's not part of the Levitical tribe at all. Okay, so I would never have the first aliyah unless there were no priests in the congregation. I would never have it. Now, I also, by the way, davened in a congregation where only men would be called up to begin with. And that's actually relevant to what I'm going to say next, which is that when I arrived at Ikar, I quickly realized, didn't quickly realize that women were being called up to the Torah. That I knew. What I did quickly realize was that they didn't have a priestly Levitical and Israelite 1, 2, 3. And I have to say, I've never gotten a full explanation for why that is, but it's generally speaking, I think there is an interest in stripping Judaism of its hierarchical practices. And that is relevant here, both in terms of the fact that the priests seem kind of elevated above the rest of the congregation. That's the part I'm a little fuzzy on. Like, do liberal Jewish movements actually dislike that hierarchy? Because it's always seemed sort of arcane to me. But I think more likely, it makes it so that a woman could never have the first aliyah. Because, you could say a woman comes from a priestly family. She's a Kohenet. But that they didn't go that route, because after all, the liberal Jewish movements were also backing away from, all the priestly rites and rituals to begin with. But the truth is, the rabbis are already backing away from those things. This is just a vestige of that institution. And at Ikar, you will not find it. And if I am correct, I don't know very well, but if I'm correct, at most Reform or conservative shuls, you won't see the priestly, some conservative, but mostly the first, second, and third. Okay, I've already talked about this for too long, but I hope that is somewhat clear. Now it's just 7 aliyot. And on top of that, yet another change that you will notice if you come to Ikar is that the custom was that one person would be called up to recite a blessing for each aliyah, whereas Ikar, we call up a whole group of people to recite the blessing together. Okay, so all kinds of changes, but the basic structure is that there are 7 aliyot, 7 goings up to the Torah. In each of them, there's a blessing beforehand and a blessing after, which we're about to look at. And then in the middle, there's 1/7 of the Torah read. So let's take a look at how that plays out. Okay. I just saw the word auction pop up in the chat, and that's right. These aliyah, there's all kinds of customs. Like they'd sell off like shlishi is a big one to get. You get the first one that you're entitled to as an Israelite who's not a priest. You you pay good money for that. Like there's all kinds of traditions. And how do you pay money on Shabbat? Good question. Okay, but there's a little bit of flourish for the first aliyah. This you'll hear me read as I'm calling up the first Oled, the first one to go up to the Torah. And it's this kind of flourish here. May you help and shield and save all who trust in you. And let us say, Amen. Let us all declare the greatness of God and give honor. This, I would still call this flourish that is added on Shabbat. And then as the first is called to the Torah, you'll see that here in the Hebrew, it says, Kohen Karav Yamod. The priest shall come forward and stand. And actually, they have what must be another tradition here, which is Bat Kohen, may the daughter of the priest, Kirvi Tamod. So I guess one way of resolving it in some communities is to call up women from priestly families, but we just don't do this at all. We have this flourish, but then we just call up whoever is going to be there for the first aliyah. And there's a special response. You'll hear people say, once I've recited this, imagine that I'm the Rabbi. The Rabbi is the name for the person who is directing the Torah service. And the congregation responds, Vatem advekim b'Adonai Elohechem, chaim kulchem hayom. You who cling to Adonai your God have all been sustained to this day. And that's a reference to the priests. The priests who devote themselves to God, it's a tribute to the priests. Okay, but so we keep the tribute, but we don't keep the priests at Ikar. Okay, so that's the first Aliyah. Now, here is something I would like to say to you. I would like to charge you with. Okay, there's a blessing before the Torah and there's a blessing after the Torah, but really there are essentially 3 lines before the Torah and 1 line after the Torah. And I remember when I was a kid memorizing these lines and being terrified anytime I was a kid. I guess I was a teenager by then, because you have to be 13 to be called up to the Torah. Anytime I was called up to the Torah, I'd be petrified that I would get it wrong. I'm sure that's a fear that some of you out there have felt. It's a totally terrifying experience to be called up to the Torah, and yet it's a great honor. And so there are a couple ways to handle that contradiction, and one is to deny the honor every time that you're called. No, I won't do it. But a better way to handle it is to memorize the blessings before and after the Torah. There are a few things in Jewish life that is really worth your time to memorize, and this is one of them. This is one of the ones that will get you by if you know these blessings. And these blessings, I said, there are 3 lines before and 1 line afterwards, so it gets pretty complicated. And believe me, I still screw this up because I'm just have the jitters when I'm up there. I mean, it's okay. It's just the most common experience in shul, but it's good to get used to it in practice. Of course, we've got signs and helpers up there, but even so, it's complicated. And it's especially complicated because the blessing before the Torah, there's a blessing there, but before the blessing, there's essentially a baruch, the call to prayer. Just like we have a baruch hu before the Shema, so we have a baruch hu before the blessing that everyone says as an oleh to the Torah. Here's what it looks like. The person called up to this Torah will say, Baruch hu et Adonai hamvarach, right? Like that's what we say before the Shema, but you say it also when you're called up. So you're the person called up to Torah, you say, Baruch hu et Adonai hamvarach, and then the congregation, this is the part where it's easy to get tripped up. The congregation responds, Baruch Adonai hamvarach leolam va'ed, and then you repeat that. Baruch Adonai hamvarach leolam va'ed, and then you recite the blessing. Okay? So just one more time. You recite this, the congregation responds. You repeat the congregation's response, and then you recite the blessing. And the blessing is, blessed are you, Adonai, our God, sovereign of time and space, who has chosen us from among the peoples, giving us the Torah. Blessed are you, God, who gives the Torah. Okay? So a blessing that marks our chosenness to have received the Torah. Chosenness, obviously, very controversial term in the modern age. I have noted that some liberal communities use a different wording, Asher kirvanu lavodato, who has drawn us into your service, or something like that, because not wanting to say chosen. But I actually like, if we're going to be chosen for anything, I like this formulation of chosenness. Chosen to receive the Torah. Yeah, that is what we were chosen for. So there's the chosenness blessing before, and then there is the gift of the Torah afterwards. So after you recite this, then you just stand there, you follow along. You in regular times, you would be standing right next to the reader. Oh, I haven't said much about this. Someone calls you up, you go up to, you'll come up on the right side of the reader. You'll come up on the right side of the reader. You'll say your blessings. You'll be standing right next to the reader. Then you'll finish your blessing. Then you will move, when you finish your blessing, you'll move over to the left side, and you stand there also for the Aliyah after yours, because the tradition is you don't want to scurry off, right? You don't just race off after, it's just like you're done and you go sit down. No, you want to linger. So that's the idea, and that's why you come up, you stand on the right, you recite your blessings, and then you rotate over to the second side. So I would recommend strongly to everyone to try and memorize these blessings. That will just put you in a more confident place should you be called up to the Torah. Okay, then there is, I said you rotate over to the left side of the bima, and then there's, when you are there, there's like a special blessing for those called up to the Torah, where you're just, may you and your entire family have blessing and success and all that. What we do instead at Ikar is we try to offer a more personal or spontaneous blessing, right? That's okay too, but there's a tradition to bless the oleh give them a blessing, and then to move on to the second. So what we will do is we'll call one person up, they'll say the blessing, we'll read, they'll say the after blessing, then we'll call the second person up, they'll come up, and the other person will rotate around, and then we'll turn and give a blessing to the first person. Okay, that makes sense? I see a hand. Yonatan?
Can you speak a little to the traditions related to the physicality of the Aliyah in terms of, I've heard that you should be wearing a tallis, you touch the tallis to the parchment, I've seen some people hold the scroll and lift it. Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on with those parts of the Aliyah?
Yeah, great. You basically said it. I mean, the two primary. Thank you for reminding me. The two primary kind of physical customs around the Torah you've said, which are, one, you should be wearing a talit, right? It's as you do when you're leading a prayer or when you're participating in any kind of sacred prayer, right? You wear a talit, but then you also there's a tradition to, and the reader will often direct you to kiss the first word, and in some traditions also to kiss the last word of the Torah reading. The idea there being that you're not actually going to read it, but this is your way of going from start to finish. Now, you don't want to touch the scroll itself. That's like Holy of Holies. You don't want to touch the scroll itself. So what you do is you take the fringes on your talit, usually the reader will point you there before you say your blessing. Before you say your blessing. So it's very, very helpful that Yonatan reminded us. Before you say your blessing, you take the fringes, the reader will point you, and the truth is, it's totally fine to just touch it down to the Torah. It's like a symbolic act. But the punctilious tradition is to touch the first word and then kiss your tzitzit instead of kissing the Torah itself. That would be a little too much. So you kiss your tzitzit and then you make the blessing. And then afterwards, similarly, you would touch the last word read and then make the blessing. I should also add, generally speaking, although I feel like I'm in murky territory here because lots of different practices. Generally speaking, the first blessing is made with the Torah open, whereas the last blessing is the one after is made with the Torah rolled up, closed. But you'll see people, practice differently there. I have not seen. I have seen, but I don't know the idea that I don't know where that comes from. The little lift that some people give when they. But I certainly was trained to hold the Torah, like to touch the roller, right? The wooden roller, right? Like as if you were holding the Torah itself. And I think some people grasp both and lift it up, but I don't know much about that tradition. Okay. Rabbi Zaki?
I wanted to mention a couple of things. One thing, you don't want to touch the Torah scroll because you have the oils in your hand and stuff. That's why you use the tzitzit.
Mm-hmm.
I just wanted to make that.
Yes, that's part of it for sure.
And then also, I do raise it because as the language is saying in the blessings, it's like receiving the Torah. I raise it so the community can actually see some of the Torah.
Yeah.
So that's my practice.
Yeah, that's nice. That's nice. Yeah, listen, there may be knowledge on this Zoom, given the fullness of and diversity of our Jewish experiences, there may be knowledge here on the Zoom that I'm not holding. So would love it if folks, care to jump in and explain things that are extra here that I'm not getting at. Okay, I'm gonna take one more though. We are running out of time. I'm trying to think what to do about that. I think we're gonna have to go over at least 15 minutes here. So sorry if you can't stay the extra time, but we have to get through the Torah service here for the good of our learning, and also so we can have a discrete unit of because we record these as well. Gideon.
The explanation that I've heard for lifting the Torah, for raising the bottom handles, is like acknowledging that it came from God. So like lifting it up towards Shemayim and acknowledging where Torah comes from.
That sounds right. Okay, that sounds right. The customs are easy to identify. The reasons are somewhat more elusive because different people have different reasons, but that one sounds right. Okay, all right, let's now keep moving a little bit through just the basic. I mean, the truth is, we, having mentioned the 7 aliyot, we have the structure of the main event, right? We spent a lot of time getting into this, and then suddenly we unroll the Torah. I mean, I should say there's even I'm focusing on liturgy, so I could also talk about how the Torah is carried on the right shoulder. There are lots of things. How do we undress the Torah? How do we dress the Torah? Lots of things that we could talk about. But we're going to focus on what's actually going on in the Siddur, in the liturgy itself. So with that in mind, okay, we just discussed the aliyot and the blessing of the oleh afterwards. And then, having blessed the oleh, there is, right, with the opening Misha Beirach, may the one who blessed our ancestors bless this person. So that is also, that beginning it's almost like it sets us up to offer another Misha Beirach, a Misha Beirach for healing, for those who are in need of healing. Now, there are different customs around that, and sometimes someone who was in need of healing would say that they needed a special blessing for healing at their Aliyah. But what we do, or maybe they would say like, hey, I've been called up, my wife is homesick, could you please say a prayer of healing for her? So they would get a prayer of healing while they were up as an oleh. What we do at Ikar, and what has become customary, is to say one general blessing for healing for all of those who are in need of healing. You probably know that we also go around the congregation and take names from people. That is not always done, probably not even usually done. Usually, people will either come up, right, to give the names, or some congregations just leave a blank space and you can mention the name in the blank space. Okay, different practices around. Sometimes people do a whole blessing for men and a whole blessing for women who needed healing, sort of like based again on Kabbalistic concepts of different sort of sources of healing, whatever. But there's a blessing for healing there. When do we do it at Ikar? We do it after the 5th Aliyah, 5 of 7. So we do the 5 Aliyot, and then we do a prayer for healing. We go around the congregation and collect names, and then we do the last 2 Aliyot. Okay, so that's the prayer for healing, which you'll see at our service. And there it is. I'll usually say this part, and then we'll pause and hear where names are to be given. We'll walk around the congregation and give them, and then we'll say the rest. Now, the one thing I wanted to highlight here, which is really interesting, is that we're saying a prayer for healing, but you may remember from last week that we said we don't pray for any of our needs on Shabbat. That's why we don't have the 12 blessings of the Amidah in our Shabbat blessing, because we don't make requests on Shabbat, because we're supposed to be in a mindset of contentment. We have everything we need. But we can't not pray for healing. I mean, you can't just say, oh yeah, don't worry, I have everything I need, even though I'm suffering from a disease. Right? We have to pray for healing. And yet we're not supposed to ask for anything. So how do we get around that? Well, the liturgy, it's almost like, I was going to say sarcastic, but it's not sarcastic. It's almost sheepish. Look at the way the liturgy actually acknowledges this. Though Shabbat is a time to refrain from crying out, we yet hope and pray that healing is at hand. Okay? Shabbat hi milizok. We're supposed to not cry out, but we have to cry out for help, which I think is a wonderful combination of sentiments. Right? It's just like we're acknowledging it would be great to be in an ideal world where we didn't need anything, but come on, we're not going to not pray for our sick. Okay, that's obvious. So that's the prayer for healing. Payam?
I just have a question. Where does the custom of chanting come from, and like how do they know like what to say? Like when they do those hand signal things?
Yeah, the custom of chanting, some would say, is the original custom. That is how they remembered the Torah, because the Torah was originally oral, right? But our theology is that the Torah was given to Moses written down. Like I think some historians or anthropologists or archaeologists say what I just said. But our tradition is that Moses wrote down the Torah and that Moses received a tradition for how the Torah was to be chanted. Now, what's the right tradition? Since Sephardic and Ashkenazic Jews chant differently, and then there are variations upon variations even in those divisions. So I don't know is my answer to your question. We refer to it as a Masoretic tradition, the tradition of the folks who carried the ancient knowledge of which notes went on which word, and there are a limited number of notes. Okay, so the way that you learn is that you learn certain notes, and then you'll see those notations on a word, and now the notations are not there in the scroll of the Torah itself. You'll have to look at a book that has them, like usually a book of the Torah has them, and you'll memorize the notation. That's why it's hard to read from the Torah, because you have to memorize those notations. But there are only so many, mapa, pashta, and it's a little bit like a tonal language, right? It's a little bit like speaking Chinese. There are 4 tones, and you hit the word with the right tone for that word. In that case, though, it has a semantic effect. In our case, it's just the tradition. And in fact, we don't correct it when someone gets the note wrong. That's like, it's not, you're not supposed to, but we don't correct it. We only correct it when someone gets the word wrong, okay? So not a full answer to your question, but that's sort of like the general area. All right, let's keep going here through the Torah service. So I said, here we are, we've called someone up and we're gonna bless them. And since we're blessing them, we could also pray for their healing. And since we're praying for their healing, we might also offer a special prayer for those who have just gone through a dangerous, life-threatening experience, okay? So someone who's just had a major surgery, or someone who has been hit by a car, or someone who has there are lots of categories for what might be considering life-threatening or dangerous. Some people will say this blessing, Birkat HaGomel, to thank God for safe passage when they have flown across any body of water. So anytime you fly back from Israel or from Europe even, you would say Birkat HaGomel. That is a very common practice, Birkat HaGomel. You'll see it at Ikar, and I want to just go over it for 1 second. Everybody recites the same blessing for Birkat HaGomel, which is Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam. It's about God. HaGomel lechayavim tovot shigmalani kol tov, right? Who bestows goodness on us despite our imperfections, and who has treated me so favorably, okay? Okay, the Gomel is like the verb that we use for someone who does kindness. So blessed is the God who has done kindness for me. And then there is, let's think of these as pronouns, right? He, she, and they, right? So there's a he, she, and they response to the Birkat HaGomel, okay? So if it were a man, you would respond Shigmalcha kol tov. It was a woman, you would respond Gmalech kol tov. It was a group, or maybe a non-binary person using a they/them pronoun, you would say Gmalchem kol tov. So slightly different responses there, and they're all listed in the Sidur. Okay, so everybody would recite the same blessing, and then we would try to get their pronouns right as we responded in response. Okay, now that's for being saved from danger. That's pretty standard. I note here that in this Sidur they also have some other blessing, Hakarat HaTov, on joyous occasions. I've never seen this done. Has anyone seen this done? Does anyone have a congregation where they respond Hatov Metiv when they get an Aliyah? I've never seen it done. I don't know where it's done, but I will say it makes a certain sense, because you can see that the opportunities that we are taking when someone gets called up to the Torah, it is a time of good and welfare. What's going on with you? We bless you. Do you need healing in your home? Have you just come back to shul after a long absence? Do you have some great thing to celebrate? This is a time when we call someone up, and it's an honor. It's a way of seeing them. It's a way of acknowledging them in the community. So you'll see all of these prayers that acknowledge different kinds of life events. We just had folks just this Shabbat who one had just undergone surgery and another had been in a very serious car accident, and they recited the Gomel, the Birkat Gomel. Okay. The other one, like I said, I don't know of any congregation that does it, but there it is in the Siddur, and it's a nice thing for recognizing joyous occasions. Okay. Oh, where am I? Okay. From there, you see this? Everybody see this? Everybody can see my Siddur? Okay, great. Okay. That's the story with being called up to the Torah. Now, after 7 aliyot, meaning after the full reading, the Gabbai, the one running the service, recites a chetzi kaddish, a small kaddish. I said earlier that a kaddish, though we associate it with the mourner, the kaddish is recited as a kind of punctuation to mark off the different sections of our prayers. Here too, it is meant to punctuate. And what it's meant to punctuate is to acknowledge that the reading has now been done. And so you shouldn't get confused because we're about to have an 8th aliyah. But that one is not, it's not extra. We've already done the 7. All right, that's a little confusing. So let me say that again. We do 7 aliyot and then we say kaddish as if to say, great, we're done. But we're going to go back and we're going to recite a maftir aliyah. Maftir aliyah. So a maftir aliyah is usually either a repetition of the 7th or more often a repetition of some verses from the end of the 7th. That's usually what it is, though sometimes there's a special maftir reading if there is an occasion like a new moon or a special reading Shabbat like Parshat Zachor, which we had recently. But what is the maftir? What is the maftir? Well, it's related to the word for haftarah, which itself just means the completing, the finishing, the completing of all your duties. What are all your duties? What are all your duties? What is the haftarah? It is another institution that was later tacked on. Nobody knows exactly when, but we've spent our whole time today talking about the institution of the public Torah reading. Somewhere along the line, they got the idea it would be good also to read from the books of the prophets. Nobody ever reads from the books of the prophets. They read the Torah and they go straight to the Talmud, right? Nobody ever reads from the books of the prophets, so we should read from the books of the prophets. And there's a certain logic to that because our prayers themselves are often taken from the last section of the Hebrew Bible, the later writings like Psalms and Proverbs. But the prophets do get overlooked sometimes in between the reading of the Torah and the liturgy, which has so much of the Psalms in it. The prophets are sort of neglected. And so there's an institution of reading, a special reading from the books of the prophets that somehow connects to the Torah reading itself. It's a very fun game to try and figure out, look at the particular Haftarah reading for that week and try to figure out why did they pick this one to go with the Torah reading. But this is also a tradition we attribute to the Masoretes, the people who came up with our tradition, like Masorah. But it's a very vague, it's a murky institute. Those folks out there somewhere who decided that. We don't really know exactly how this tradition started. But there is a tradition to recite also a reading from the books of the prophets. The Bar Bat Mitzvah will do that often if it's their. They'll read the Torah and they'll also read the Haftarah. But if not, then whoever is reading from the books of the prophets, we'll soon see there are special blessings before and after that. And there's a different cantillation, different notes that we read. It's actually, in my opinion, a more beautiful cantillation. Just the key that it's in is more beautiful. But the reason for the maftir aliyah is that we will call up the person, usually the person who is going to read the reading from the prophets. We honor them with an aliyah to the Torah. Okay, that's the maftir aliyah. Or technically, if it was a woman, we would say maftirah, right? She is the one who performs the haftarah. She's the maftirah. Okay, so here is the maftir. Oh. No, sorry. Okay, the Siddur does not have a separate maftir, right? Because they don't need to. That's going to be the same blessing before and after the Torah that we, hold on, where did it? There it is. The same blessing for before and after the Maftir Aliyah. And then we're really done with the Torah and ready to roll the Torah scroll up. And so then we call up two other people who are honored with Hagba and Glila. Hagba means raising and Glila means rolling. Okay, so someone, usually someone with good strong arms, is called up to lift the Torah. Lift the Torah the way that Ezra the scribe lifted the Torah, right? It's a big deal. And we lift the Torah, and so that everybody can see the scroll of the Torah. That was important to the people, to see the words of the Torah. Now, at the beginning of our discussion tonight, someone asked about the pinky thing. What is the pinky thing? Well, the tradition is when the Torah is being lifted to point to the Torah, and we point with our pinky finger, and to say these lines here. V'zot HaTorah asher sam, v'zot HaTorah asher sam Moshe lifnei bnei Yisrael al pi Adonai biyad Moshe. This is the Torah, God's word by Moses' hand, which Moses set before the people. Now, why is that there? Actually, I think here in our Siddur, there is, here, the liturgist, you see this here? It's small writing, but the liturgist, let's see if I can make that a little bigger. The liturgists combine Deuteronomy 4:44 and Numbers 9:23 in this line, underscoring that our entire Torah came from Moses as dictated by God. This theological claim is not made in the Bible itself. So that's like the conservative movement's editor saying, we're not sure we even believe that. But the tradition emerges at a time when the special and unique prophecy of Moses is being challenged by, Christians maybe, and other sectarians, and even the idea that the Torah is precise in a way that later prophecy is not, right? So various challenges on the idea that Moses's prophecy is God's word in a way that nothing is. So our response was to raise the Torah and say, Moses wrote that Torah. This is exactly as God wrote. So it's a like theologically defensive or aggressive, however you want to think of it, moment in our service. Now, why the pinky? Why the pinky? I once asked someone that, and he thought for a minute, and he said, well, you know how it is when now this is a great Torah scholar I asked, but I'm not going to mention his name because I don't like his answer. But he said, when we're reading, you read like this, and you're following along, and so then the Torah is raised, so you just lift your pinky it's just natural. And I was like, what? Who reads like this? What are you talking about? So I actually don't know, and if someone knows, I'd love to know the answer to why the pinky, but I've never gotten a good answer. Okay, we are really, really over time now here, so let's just see if there's anything else that we should just make sure to cover here before we finish today. The blessing before the Haftarah, I said now, this is probably not relevant for you except to know that it's happening, but boy, the blessings before and after the prophetic readings are elaborate, right? There are two before, and there are, 4 afterwards, okay? So I'm not gonna go through them all, but if you were so inclined to read the Haftarah, you would also have to learn these blessings, and there's a certain tune for them. Al HaTorah, Val Havodah, Val Enviim, Val Yom HaShabbat Hazeh, Shenatata Lanu, Adonai Eloheinu L'Kedusha, Menucha, Lechavod U'Letiferet. So that's like I don't even know if I said that exactly right. So like there's a whole nusach, meaning a whole melody for these blessings also. Okay. Then finally, there are just some closing. Now we still have the Torah out, and while the Torah out, just as the Aliyah was an opportunity to bless the person and to hear about what's going on in the person's life, so the Torah service itself is like it's the moment when we are all gathered. It is thought of as the moment that everybody would come and gather around to hear the Torah, because that's how the tradition started. Everybody gathered together. And since it's a time of gathering, it also is a good time to address all of the needs of our community, okay? So there are all kinds of traditional blessings that are said at the end of the Torah service. You will note some of them are, here, I'm going to go forward and then go back, and I'll end on a joke. There's a prayer, here's a classic, a prayer for our country, right? But it's different in every congregation. None of these are obligatory. It's just by custom, there's a prayer for the country. Some of them, this Siddur has a prayer for the American military. The Lev Shalem does not have that one. Some of them have a prayer for the state of Israel. Some do not. Some have a prayer for the state of Israel and a prayer for the Israeli military, right? The safety of it. Then there's prayers for peace. There's prayers for captives, for people in captivity. There are all kinds of various prayers that are said at this moment. But the most traditional one is called Yukum Purkan. Yukum Purkan. Let's just take a look at it and then we'll close for the evening because we're way over time here. But I'm scrolling back. Well, hold on one sec. Let's just scroll forward so we see everything that's in our Siddur. A prayer for the renewal of creation. That one we don't say at Ikar. A prayer for our country. Well, sometimes we say it, or sometimes we like this better, or sometimes we say a different prayer for our country. A prayer for the state of Israel. Again, sometimes some people prefer different kinds of prayers for the state of Israel. There are options here. A prayer for peace. What else is there? Okay, that's it. Now I want to go back to the prayer known as Yukum Purkan, a prayer for the congregation. Yukum Purkan. May heaven bestow deliverance. Yukum Purkan. May deliverance come from the heavens upon this holy congregation, the adults and their children. Right? Then there's a prayer for those who serve the community. And actually, it's hard to tell this joke from the Lev Shalem because the Lev Shalem does not have the first Yukum Purkan, which is a prayer specifically to bless the scholars of the congregation. And you know, I really feel like we ought to bring it back. No, but seriously, there's that one is not there because these are all just like more and more and more, and you could be there all day saying different prayers. But I'll just end with this joke, and it's not a good joke, but it's a joke that gives you a sense of how Jewish liturgy works, which is the joke, which I'll tell faster than it should be told. It's like some kind of ecumenical council to like work towards world peace. And the Western religions famous Western religions come together, and everyone is being asked to sacrifice something for the cause of world peace. And the Christians say, we hereby renounce the divinity of Jesus. We still really believe in it, but we know that has been misconstrued and taken too literally and misunderstood by people, and it's hard for our Muslim and Jewish brothers and sisters. So we renounce the divinity of Jesus. And the Muslims say, we hereby rescind the concept of jihad. Jihad is supposed to be a holy struggle, but it's been misinterpreted by people and misused. So I know that it's really threatening to people. So we're renouncing the concept of jihad, and like a group of rabbis like shuffles up and says, we've decided to get rid of the second Yukum Purkan, right? So it's not a good joke, but the joke is like, we're so fascinated about every little piece of this. So that's what we would give up for world peace, is maybe not even the first Yukum Purkan, but the second one. Well, this Siddur did that job by taking out, but they took out the one for the scholars, not for the one for the congregation. The joke presumes you would actually take out the one for the congregation also. But anyway, it's not a good joke, I said, but it is an example of how things get added and added and added and added in our prayer book. And then it's like, well, but you have to say the prayer for the American military. It's in there, right? But actually, that's just a decision that these editors of this prayer book made. So some of this stuff is really core, and some of it is just like, well, different traditions, varied traditions. But I hope you have a general sense that that this Torah service is a time when we reenact, the basics of it are pretty simple. We reenact this since the days of Ezra, this ancient rite of reciting the Torah out loud before the congregation, an incredibly powerful experience. But how we do that and the number of people that go up and the particular blessings that we're going to offer them and the other blessings that we're going to tack in at that time when the whole community is gathered, all of those things are somewhat variable. And so you'll see our version of it at Ikar. The last thing I'll just say before we close, which is just to be complete here, is that one last thing that might happen every 4 weeks or so is that if the new month begins in the week that is coming up, we also say the blessing for the new month. It's something we like to say while the Torah is out. And actually, the person who says it will be holding the Torah, or somebody will be holding it next to them. And we will announce the new month so that at that moment, when the whole congregation is gathered, they know when Rosh Chodesh will begin, because it's not a thing that an average person would know. So there's an announcement. The new month of, the next one will be Nisan, will begin on blank. May it hold blessing. And so we recite this final thing while the Torah is out. Then we say Ashrei, though we don't do that at Ikar, but Ashrei is often a kind of closing psalm. And then we return the Torah. Much as we took it out, so we return the Torah. There's a little verse from Psalms again. And everybody rises as we return the Torah. Remember, every time the Torah is picked up, everybody in the congregation rises. So the leader says this, and the congregation responds. I'm kind of racing here. And then as the Torah goes back around, usually it'll go back the opposite way that it came. Like it'll go around the congregation clockwise and it'll come back counterclockwise or something like that. And again, people will kiss the Torah as it comes by, or often they will not kiss the Torah. They'll use their Siddur to kiss the Torah, right? They'll maintain some respectful distance. Meanwhile, the congregation is singing this psalm, Psalm 29. And then finally, as the Torah is placed into the ark, there's this special prayer here that refers to when the ark was set down, Moses would say, Adonai, may you dwell among the myriad families of the people of Israel. Now, where does this come from? This comes from the book of Numbers. And actually, there's a kind of elegant ending to the Torah service, because we opened with, when the ark would travel, that was what we opened. That's from the book of Numbers 10:35. And then the next line is, and when it would settle, when it would go back. Now that what that means really in the desert is stopping, but for our purposes, it means going back into the ark. And so we sort of bookend it with the other half of that thought from the book of Numbers. Something elegant about that. And then, we just can't resist. So a few more lines of flourish here, the most famous of which is Eitz Chaim hi lemachazikim ba v'tomchea me'ushar. It's a tree of life for those who grasp it, and all who hold on to it are blessed. That's a verse from the book of Proverbs. And this, I think, is also from the book of Proverbs. So there's Proverbs in here. The last one is from the book of Lamentations. There's just all these last lines that are just like, oh my gosh, the Torah is leaving us. The Torah is so great. We love the Torah as it is being. And at this point, we're all standing again as we were at the beginning, and the ark is open. And then when we finish reciting, may you renew our days like the days of old. Chadesh Yemenu Kedem. Then we close the ark, and that is it. And then we recite a Kaddish and move on to Musaf, except that the rabbi needs to then say something, right? So the rabbi actually stops the show and jumps in and says, now I will talk to you. And that's where the sermon comes in. But the sermon is, that's just a modern invention anyway. That's not essential. So we're not going to be covering that. We will return next week to consider quickly, because we went an hour and a half today, actually. We didn't have time for Musaf. And you see what happens to Musaf? You see what happens? But we'll do a lightning fast review of Musaf next time, and then Kabbalat Shabbat. We'll end with Kabbalat Shabbat, truly one of the most beautifully composed prayers in our tradition. So, wow, I didn't expect to teach for an hour and a half tonight. I'm sorry about that, but given the nature of our project, it's important that we saw everything, and I'm grateful for those who were able to stick around. Thank you, everybody. I will end here, but so please feel free to go. If there are any lingering questions, we do have 2 minutes left, and Ariel is able to stick around. I'll take questions. Any last questions? I don't see any hands coming up. Okay. All right. Oh, I see a hand. Yes, Yonatan.
I'll ask a question if you let me.
Sure.
So if someone's passing by you with the Torah on one side and the king of Israel is passing you on the other, which side do you face?
For sure the Torah. For sure the Torah. Right? Torah is the king of Israel. The Torah is the king of Israel. And that's what a lot of this liturgy suggests. Malchutcha malchut kol olamim. I mean, the truth is, the king. I'm taking your questions seriously. I think you mean it half seriously, but the half that is serious. The king of Israel is God. The queen of Israel is God. Right? We don't we'll have rulers, but that's not the point. And so the Torah really is. In fact, I'll close with this. In the book of Deuteronomy, it says, "Vayihi b'Shurun melech." There was in Jeshurun, another name for Israel, a king. And it's not clear who it's talking about. Is it talking about Moses? It seems like it's Moses, maybe, but Moses is saying it, so that's weird. It could be God, but I believe that it's Yehuda Halevi, one great medieval poet, who says, "Zeh Torah." The king of Israel is the Torah, right? So yes, if you got the king of Israel, who is the king of Israel? I don't know. But let's say you had great royalty on one side and the Queen of England on one side and the Torah passing by on the other. No question, no doubt. You turn to the Torah. No disrespect to the Queen, but you turn to the Torah. All right, everyone. I think that's our time, and thanks so much for being here. And we will return one last time next week. Thanks again to Ariella. Thanks to Mary Ann. Thanks to Marlon, who helped us be here at all tonight. Appreciate you all.